Welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to have you here at this CRADLE seminar. I'm Phil Dawson. I'm the Associate Director of CRADLE, which is the Centre for Research and Assessment and Digital Learning here at Deakin University. So happy you can join us for this seminar on theory in academic integrity, research and practice with Dr. Guy Curtis. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm located here today. We pay our respects to the local people wherever we are for allowing us to have our gathering on their land and to their elders past, present and future. I invite you to type your location into the chat and acknowledge the traditional owners of where you are located. And I acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty has not been ceded. Before introducing Dr. Guy Curtis, I want to just mention a few procedural things about how we're going to run things today. So the rough running sheet is that Guy's going to talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll have questions and we'll do a formal close at 3 p.m. So people who need to can go off to other meetings and that sort of thing. You can sort of exit gracefully. Guy's agreed to stick around for further questions if there are any till 3:30. This is a Zoom webinar, so your camera and microphone won't work. So if you've got to go to the bathroom and take this webinar with you to the bathroom, we'll never know. So there is no way for us to do your camera and microphone. But that also means that to communicate, you can use the chat. We won't be using the chat for Q&A. So when it comes to questions, if your great question is there in the chat, it probably will be lost. But for questions, we'll be using the Q&A function. So you can see that as the Q&A thing at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click that, you can type in a question if you've got one, and importantly, you can thumbs up other questions. And we'll deal with the questions in priority of which ones have the most thumbs up. So if you don't have anything to ask, still get in there and thumbs up some questions. We'll be recording this seminar, so you would have had that little recording in progress thing. We share these usually within a week or two after the seminar with a recap, so a little write-up on there as well. So that's sort of our order of ceremonies today. Now on to the good stuff. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Guy Curtis, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Psychological Science at the University of Western Australia. His research interests include academic integrity and applied psychology with a focus on individual differences in academic misconduct and organisational leadership. He's an author of over 50 journal articles and book chapters, co-editor of an upcoming book on contract cheating, and a multi-award winning university teacher. Guy's work I've been following for quite a long time now. I like how Guy takes a really different angle to most other people in the space. Guy published this great paper about why students don't cheat, which when it came out, I was like, oh yeah, why aren't we focusing on that question some more? Together with Kiara Rundle, she led this paper chapter. Guy also published about using a Swiss cheese model for thinking about cheating and academic integrity. And if you've seen me talk, you'll know that that's like a big part of my shtick now is that. And they were the ones to come up with this cool idea. And I guess just sort of overall, I like how Guy's work is a bit more robust. Research into cheating and academic integrity than what's the norm, a bit more theoretical, and really drawing on things from the discipline of psychology. So yeah, Guy, it's an absolute joy to have you here. I'm said enough. I'm going to hand over to you. This is going to be so great. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, you've talked me up very well there, and I really hope I can deliver. I'm just going to go to the screen share now to get my slides up for this presentation. Hopefully, someone in the chat can just give me a thumbs up that I can be heard, and then I'll be happy to go. I realized my side, it can hear you. Yay. Okay. So just checking. I knew my mic was off and all that kind of thing. All right. So I'm talking partly into the void here, the way that this setup works. I'm only seeing my slides. I'm not seeing anyone's. I'm not really seeing anyone's reactions. You should potentially see my face and my slides. So my presentation topic is an increasing role for theory in academic integrity research and practice, some psychology studies, statistics and stories, although as I've footnoted here, there aren't any stories, but I like alliteration, so I had to get another S word in there. So my presentation is going to be focusing a little on some of my work and research in the area of academic integrity, but also talking about some other people who are making real theory-based contributions to understanding academic integrity and academic misconduct. I'd say a few weeks ago, it's probably now a couple of months ago, Sarah Eaton, who's going to be editing the next handbook of academic integrity, asked whether my colleague Joe Clare and I would write a chapter on theory in academic integrity, because he and I both do a lot of theory-driven research in the area of academic integrity. Or theory-informed research, and we said yes to this. And I was asked to do this talk for Deakin, and I thought, what can I put into my talk? And I thought, well, if I start thinking about theory-driven questions in academic integrity, that can help begin to shape some of that chapter in my mind, and get me thinking about some of the bits and pieces that I might talk about there. Before I get any further on the presentation itself, I'd like to mention that I'm from the University of Western Australia. The University of Western Australia's campus is situated on Noongar land, and the Noongar people remain the spiritual and custodial custodians of the land and continue to practice their values, language, beliefs and knowledge. Pay their respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm currently on family holiday and I'm in Canberra. So I'm on Ngunnawal land. So again, pay respects to the Ngunnawal people and their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm here in a hotel room with my family, who I hope will be nicely listening to their own devices in the room while I'm talking, rather than listening to me and giving me terrible feedback afterwards. Okay, so the point of view of my talk is a lot about theory-driven research and theory-informed research, and the role for theory in academic integrity research, because so much academic integrity research that exists is basically descriptive research. The whole point of it is to find something about academic integrity, such as how much plagiarism is going on, how much cheating is going on, who does it, what the advertisers of contract cheating services are putting in their ads. And these descriptive bits of research are really helpful because they tell us things that we wouldn't otherwise know unless people were engaging in the bits of descriptive research. At the same time, people doing descriptive research are just giving us facts from which we then need to think about why those facts exist. And that's where the role of theory comes in. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation is the role for theory. So here we have a picture, and one of the lines on this graph is the line of, whoops, sorry, went back too fast, is a line from 4 studies that I've been involved in collecting data on at Western Sydney University every 4 years, rates of plagiarism and cheating. And that's great. It's nice to know that over the time that I've been doing that, from 2004 through to the 4th data collection in 2019, there was a downward trend, which seems to have slowed up a little bit, but still slightly there. All of that's good to know, but a really important question that would go along with what is the trend, what is the rate of plagiarism and cheating, is why is that happening? It's that theory-informed question. And that why question is one that I've had a stab at in that research, thinking it might be driven by our better educational and detection methods that have emerged over time, but that is role for future research. Okay, so theory-driven research, I'm going to talk about some of my own, some that has yet to be published, and some from other people. But we have questions like, what are the roles of emotion and personality traits, what factors and how people have about themselves, their personalities, their culture, how do those interact in predicting people's engagement in academic misconduct, and so on and so forth. As I said, I'll be mentioning studies by other people, not just my own in this context. But just to start us off, I'm going to start talking about a theory called the theory of planned behavior. A theory of planned behavior is a psychology theory that emerged out of the problem that psychology discovered, which is that attitudes don't do a very good job of predicting people's behavior a lot of the time. Now, we normally think that attitudes predict behavior. So if you have a positive attitude towards something, you say really like environmental issues, we would think that that might predict your behavior, such as not littering, recycling, having solar panels on your house, driving an electric car, all of that kind of thing. But as it turns out, our attitudes aren't particularly great predictors of our behavior. They predict a bit, which is at least nice, and it does make a little bit of sense that they do, but they don't predict our behavior very strongly, and particularly not in specific situations. The theory of planned behavior suggests that a combination of attitudes, so how we feel or think about something, our subjective norms, and that is what we think other people would do in the same situation, what we think is the normal kind of behavior, and perceived behavioral control, which is the extent to which we actually feel that we can do something about the particular behavior, all predict our intentions. That is what we plan to do. So this is what's the theory of planned behavior. It's about what we expect to do in the future, what we plan to do in a situation. And that intention then predicts behavior, but it doesn't predict it perfectly, because there's situations, for example, using the academic conduct situation, for example, you might go into an exam as a student with an intention to cheat, and then find that the way you had planned to cheat couldn't happen because the assessment security is such that you can't access a device or something like that in a way that you plan to. So the intention won't perfectly predict behavior, because sometimes something intervenes between intention and behavior. So for me, of late, over the last few years, a lot of the studies that I have done looking at academic misconduct have varied off a theme of the theory of planned behavior, looking at whether attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control around academic integrity, plagiarism, cheating, academic misconduct predict intentions in that space, and then ultimately predict that academic misconduct behavior. So what I'm going to take you through in the first part of my talk is a number of the studies that I've used the theory of planned behavior as the basis for thinking about how factors might interact in predicting academic misconduct. Within these studies, I've tried to do some things that I think in research are make the research better, or make the research more robust and transferable, make the results more likely to be reliable and valid. So as Phil said, one of the things he liked in my research is sort of the robustness of it. I really do try to do some things that make that make the research work better, and a lot of it draws out of my training, which is in psychology research with people. So obviously, with research on academic integrity and academic misconduct, I use student samples, but what I try to do where I can is get samples of students from multiple universities. So we're not just looking at students who are exposed to a single set of, say, academic integrity policies, procedures, education, and so on. I try to get samples in my research of a good size, so 250 plus. Almost all the studies I'm going to talk about in this presentation of my own have 300 plus students, again, which gives you more statistically reliable results. I use a variety of measures and procedures, but typically through online survey-based things. But what I'll do with online surveys is I'll do things like vary the order of questionnaires to allow for order effects. Where I can, I'll use validated measures of some of the concepts. So there's some really well-designed measures of personality or emotion. There's some specific scales of attitudes towards academic integrity norms, but then to make sure that these findings are reliable over different ways of measuring the same thing, I'll sometimes create measures of, say, academic integrity, attitudes, norms, intentions, and so on. In asking people these questions within a questionnaire, I'll also put in checks that they're actually paying attention to what they do. I'll pay some attention myself to whether people are answering too quickly or just sort of hitting yes to get through a survey, and sometimes social desirability measures as well. I've seen some really recent research questioning the usefulness of social desirability measures, but one of the things you can think would often happen in studies of academic integrity and academic misconduct is that people might try to present themselves in a good light and say, not admit to engaging in bad behaviour. So a social desirability measure can help moderate that a little bit. The statistical analyses I've then done in some of these studies typically depend on correlation or relationships, but I've built up the analysis into looking at predicting people's behaviour from their attitudes and intentions and so on, using regression-based models, looking at the question of mediation, so such as whether attitudes predict intentions, predict behaviour. So in that case, the intention is the mediator between attitudes and behaviour, and also structural equation modelling, so putting together variables in the way that I think go together and seeing whether that model fits the data, and then also looking at whether a better model is a better fit for the data. So taking a whole bunch of different methods, but also trying to use good practice in those methods has been a basis for a lot of my approach to the research. Okay, so backtracking a bit in time to a study that was published a couple of years ago, the theory of planned behaviour says that subjective norms, attitudes, and perceived behavioural control predicts intentions, and then the behaviour itself, in this case, academic misconduct. Another theory that informed my thinking here is a theory from criminology called the general theory of crime, which says that bad behaviour is often influenced by self-control, which is your ability to stop yourself from doing something, rather than perceived behavioural control, which is your feeling that you can do something. So in this study, the interesting thing is that I substituted in self-control instead of perceived behavioural control into the theory of planned behaviour, and we found that this model was a good predictor of engagement in academic misconduct. One of the things that's useful about this was there's not many studies that had looked at self-control instead of perceived behavioural control in any theory of planned behaviour study. So my research has been adding to theory of planned behaviour research as well as adding to academic integrity research. And in fact, what I couldn't find at all was a study that had looked at both self-control and perceived behavioural control. And so in a second study that was published in the same paper, we had perceived behavioural control and self-control, which you can see down on the bottom left. The other thing that I thought would be interesting to look at was different types of subjective norms, because subjective norms, that is what you think is the appropriate behaviour and situation, come in two types. There's what's called a descriptive norm, which is what you think other people do, and there's what's called an injunctive norm, which is what you think other people think is the right thing to do in that situation. And I've been working on some other research on personality per se and cross-cultural sort of differences in personality. And one of the things we found was injunctive norms played a really big role in people's behavioural consistency from one situation to another. So what you think the rules are that people should do is really important. And in this particular study, we found that as well, that injunctive norms were a really big predictor, one of the strongest predictors of academic misconduct. So that's kind of useful. Saying theory is great because it can tell us why people do things, maybe, but it's also great because it can then tell us what might happen if you do something about that, which is that if we make injunctive norms salient, if we tell people this is the right thing to do, making that very salient to people, they might be more likely to do the right thing. There's certainly people who've made that argument in a number of different places. Okay. Now, there's only 3 boxes on this on this diagram, but this is a study that I published with one of my PhD students who's now graduated, Isabeau Tyndall, where we looked at whether those components of the theory of planned behaviour, subjective norms and attitudes, could be influenced by emotions. In this case, it's subjective norms and attitudes to academic integrity or academic misconduct. And we're looking at whether emotions can influence these, because there's lots of research, and this is actually where I did my PhD, on the role of emotions in influencing our perceptions of other people and perceptions in a social context. And we know that in general, emotions don't just make us feel the way that we think the emotion will make us feel about other things. So it's not just if we're happy, we find things good, and if we're sad, we find things bad. It can be the case that a negative emotion might make us more positively disposed towards doing something bad, like engaging in academic misconduct. And that's what we found here, that in particular, the more negative emotions students are experiencing, the more positive their attitude was towards plagiarism, and the more they expected plagiarism was common. So their subjective norm was it was more common. We, of course, wanted to go beyond this and find out whether that then led to intentions to plagiarize and actual plagiarism behavior or academic misconduct behavior. And so in a study published last year, when we did do that follow-up, we got those connections from subjective norms and attitudes to intentions and academic misconduct. If you think about this in real life, again, if you're ever investigating an academic misconduct case, you'll find students talking about having been stressed, having been worried, having been anxious, having been depressed, any of these sorts of things as precipitants of why they might have taken some kind of shortcut, like copying something off the internet or getting someone else to do their work for them. This makes a lot of sense in the practical realm, but we also can see that there's interactive processes here of subjective norms, attitudes, intentions, where we've got the possibility of intervening at any of those points in people's thinking and their belief to potentially reduce academic misconduct. We also followed up this study by adding in that self-control element that had been in previous research. And we expect, for example, negative emotions will influence your expectations of self-control, how much control you think you have in being able to stop yourself from doing something. When you're feeling anxious, for example, people tend to have a motivation to feel in control of things, to restore control. When people are feeling depressed, it's often because they feel that there's little control over why they're feeling sad. They can't do anything about it. So that we expected negative emotions would influence self-control as well as attitudes, subjective norms, all of which would influence attention and then academic misconduct. And again, we found that, and that's reported in the paper. Something I've been looking at a bit as well is this thing called the dark triad of personality, which is qualities or traits called psychopathy, which is a tendency to not really care about other people and be a bit impulsive. Machiavellianism, which is a tendency to do things that, again, at the expense of other people to get ahead. And narcissism, which is more about having a very high opinion of yourself and grandiose opinions of yourself. In a paper published earlier this year, I had a couple of studies where we're looking at whether psychopathy and Machiavellianism, again, predicted subjective norms and attitudes, but into the mix we added anticipated emotions, because we thought that if you think, say, cheating is more common, and in this case it was about contract cheating intentions. and you think that cheating is not so bad, you won't anticipate feeling quite so guilty if you actually engage in cheating, and you won't anticipate feeling shame if you're actually caught cheating. And again, we got something like this model that's presented here as the results, that psychopathy and Machiavellianism tend to predict subjective norms and attitudes, which tended to predict people's anticipation that they'd feel guilt and shame, which then predicted their attitudes to engage in contract cheating. I supervised an honours student last year following that study up. What we added to this was an actual measure of engagement in academic misconduct. In this study, we used a bunch of different outsourcing and cheating behaviours as our outcome. And what we found was that psychopathy, we only looked at psychopathy in this one, predicted subjective norms, attitudes, anticipated shame and guilt, or anticipated moral emotions, as we can call them together, intentions to engage in academic misconduct of the various kinds of outsourcing and contract cheating kinds of things, and then actual engagement in that. And that's a 1, 2, 3, 4-step process that turned out to be statistically significant. When we found that, we thought that was really neat. And the idea, as you can see with the in preparation up the top of this slide, is to write that up and hopefully publish that sometime soon. In an upcoming chapter in the contract cheating book that Phil mentioned in the opening, I've kind of summarized these things to that I've already been talking about, that our feelings like negative emotions might influence our attitudes, norms, and perceived behavioural control. And then from the subsequent studies, that those might influence people's anticipated emotional state. And from there, that would predict intentions and behaviour in the space of cheating. Essentially what this is the standard theory of planned behaviour that I presented at the start: attitudes, norms, perceived behavioural control, intentions, and behaviour. But the boxes that are black are additions to the theory of planned behaviour. And as far as I can find in the literature, no one has done a study that has tested this model yet. So this is where that what we think is going to happen, what we might try out, the why kinds of questions become really interesting, because we think it'll work, but we don't know yet. Something else I've been looking at is, again, the sort of personality or dispositional kinds of tendencies people have. There's a measure that exists in the world of people's tendency to experience guilt and shame. I looked at whether that predicts people's anticipation of actually feeling those emotions in the case of engaging in academic misconduct, and then their intentions to do so. And that seems to work out from the data analysis I've done so far, but again, not yet published. Also, something I published earlier this year was looking at whether those dark triad of personality traits would predict feelings of entitlement in an educational setting. So entitlement is where you think you should be given special treatment, pretty much just because you are you, that your teacher should pay you more attention, give you extensions, and all of these sorts of things. Entitlement in academic context, there's a measure that breaks it up into two types: those expectations that you'll be treated well, but also what you think, who you think is responsible for your learning. And what we found in this research was, in particular, that externalized responsibility, that expectation that your teacher is responsible for your learning rather than you, was what predicted academic misconduct and what mediated the relationship between these dark triad traits and academic misconduct. And that's kind of useful because we can educate students in an educational setting about who is responsible for their learning. And the more we can internalize their responsibility, the more we might be able to cut down on academic misconduct. Also, 2019, there was a paper published that proposed a light triad of personality traits that are associated with people actually being nice rather than people being not nice to other people, which includes humanism, belief in the sort of goodness of people; faith in humanity, which is expecting that people will do the right thing; and what's called Kantianism, which is the expectation that the belief that people are an end in themselves would be treated as an end in themselves rather than a means to an end. So almost like the opposite of Machiavellianism. I have already looked at some of the results where I've measured these three light triad traits as well as the three dark triad traits together, and as well as looking at whether those their impact on academic misconduct is mediated by entitlement. Once again, there was some mediation by externalized responsibility, and principally Kantianism, treating people as an end in itself, was a predictive variable. This is something I need to think much more about as I go about writing up these results. So from what I've talked about so far, the theory of planned behaviour-based studies, there's some useful lessons. At a psychological level, academic misconduct seems to be driven by sequential and interacting factors that include individual differences like personality and emotional processes like felt emotions and anticipated emotions. It's not just if you have this attitude, you will engage in this behavior, but there's certainly lots of things that can figure in together. The theory of planned behavior can be expanded to include these ideas like precursors of attitudes, such as felt emotions or anticipated emotions that might be a consequence of attitudes, and many other relevant variables. So some of the work I've been doing has been expanding on what we know about the theory of planned behavior and how that can be adapted and made a better predictive model of people's behavior, not just something telling us about academic integrity specifically. But practically from all that, there's lots of factors that can influence the likelihood of academic misconduct, and we can influence a lot of those factors, which is, I think, really helpful. Okay, so I'm now going to switch over to talking about some different stuff apart from the theory of planned behavior. I'm looking at the time, and am I doing okay, I think. One of the things I put up first up was descriptive research. How much is academic misconduct happening? And in general, those results come from studies that do things like ask people, students in a survey, whether they have engaged in various kinds of academic misconduct. The problem with doing that in general is that people will not necessarily tell the truth. And there's reasons why, in particular for bad behaviour, surveys tend to underestimate how much people are doing something that's wrong. But a theory-informed method for estimating the prevalence of hidden behaviours does exist in the world. So in a study, again, it's currently in press, but it came out online last year. With my colleagues, we were looking at using a new and different method to estimate the prevalence of engagement in commercial contract cheating among students in Australia. So our self-report studies, the things that we know about, all estimate prevalence of students engaging in commercial contract cheating, that is buying assignments and submitting them as their own, in the range of about 2 to 3%. And this all comes from studies where people are asked overt questions, have you done this? But the problem, of course, is people aren't particularly great at telling the truth, even in anonymous surveys where they should be comfortable in telling the truth. But a method exists called the Bayesian truth serum method, where you can provide an incentive to people to tell the truth even while they remain anonymous. I won't go into the details of it too much in here. I don't think I have time. I'd say go read the paper. Or potentially summaries of it, because I had an article in The Conversation about it as well, which is even more lay summary. But the paper itself, what we found using this method, giving people an incentive to tell the truth, was, and I'll show you here, the Bayesian truth serum condition versus the survey as normal. People were 2.46 times more likely to admit to having a custom ghostwriter when given an incentive to tell the truth. And something like, 2 times more likely to admit to engaging in the behavior of getting a file from a file sharing site and submitting it as their own. So either or both of these kinds of contract cheating the control condition, no incentive to tell the truth, came in at 3.5%, which is the same as most regular studies, but actually the admission rate was a bit higher still. This method also takes into account some other estimates. We didn't just ask people with or without an incentive to tell the truth, did you do these things? We also asked people how frequently they think their peers do this, and we also asked them how much other people would admit to engage, or the people who had done these behaviours would admit to engaging in them. That then helps us produce some other estimates of engagement in these activities. So we have the self-report, how much people said that they did it, but also the self-report divided by the admission estimate. So let's just say 1% of people admit to doing something that 10% of people who do would in fact admit to, then you could think that the actual admission rate is too low. You can divide the admission rate by the estimated admission rate to get another estimate. And then you can also look at how much people think their peers are doing things. And then we average those three figures, and that gave us these figures that are in numbers in boxes on the screen here. Around about 8% of students engaging in buying custom written assignments, and a bit over 11% submitting assignments from file sharing sites as the estimates that come from this method. Talking to people who are sort of deeply buried in the contract cheating investigation area, many of them think these figures are a bit more realistic, and of course they come out of a really theory-driven way of doing this kind of research. Okay, so now for other different theoretical perspectives on the concepts of academic misconduct. I'm going to draw your attention to this one here. Alderman and colleagues in the recent book, Cheating Academic Integrity, that's edited by David Rettinger and Tricia Bertram-Gallant, had a chapter named Academic Motivation and Cheating: A Psychology Perspective. And in that chapter, they talk about all different theories that might tell us why students would be motivated to cheat or engage in academic misconduct, and examples of the kinds of research questions that might come out of those. So again, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. Just for people who have looking at a recording of this, they can go back and look at the book chapter. But what it tells us is there's a lot of potential theories that we can use to predict why students might engage in academic misconduct. Another thing Phil mentioned this at the start of his talk, the Swiss cheese model. What we did here was thinking from a number of different perspectives. What might be the barriers to engagement in academic misconduct? Why might people engage in academic misconduct or plagiarism and cheating? And how can we conceptualize that in a way that's useful for people to both understand and for people to practically use in some kind of situation? So someone by the name of Reason came up with a Swiss cheese model in accident analysis and prevention. It's the idea that there are always barriers to accidents occurring, but none of those barriers are perfect. And if the holes line up, if the problems, each barrier doesn't stop the thing that's supposed to happen, an accident can occur. We were also thinking about criminology theories of why people engage in bad behavior, so in criminal situation. And I channel my friend Joe Clare here, saying a motivated offender in the presence of a suitable target with the absence of a capable guardian is likely to engage in a crime. So our barriers to engaging in academic misconduct are our capable guardians. So someone who might want to do it, who can do it on an assignment, if the barriers can't stop them, then they will. But what makes a motivated offender? Well, I've already been talking about things like psychological individual differences, and people's situations might predispose them to be more likely to engage in academic misconduct. And then what are these barriers? And I took the four E's that people talk about in the field of transport planning as a way to recognise what we have in a higher education situation. The environment, that is the okay, so hopefully it looked like I was crashing right in the middle of talking about the Swiss cheese model. I'll leave the Swiss cheese model. And knowing that we don't have a lot of time, I will just pick up here. Smith et al. Last year published this nice little paper incorporating together the fraud triangle from criminology and the dark triad model of personality, which I was talking about earlier. You can see all the various hypotheses on this about the interconnections of how they think. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, predict capability, opportunity and motivation, rationalization and intention to engage in academic misconduct and then subsequently actions. Again, really nice model, really like this one. And I understand there's going to be another paper on this coming out soon. Also in the realm of criminology, we have Victoria Nagy from, I think she's University of Tasmania, and her colleague at, I think, Deakin, have published a paper on engagement in contract cheating from a criminology perspective, looking at theories like rational choice theory, which is that people have rationale for why they do what they do in a cheating situation. Finally, I think this is finally for my slideshow. I was recently thinking about how we might improve academic misconduct detection, and it came to mind that the idea is what we're doing is separating a signal, which is something that's wrong, something that's maybe plagiarized or cheated, from a noise, which is background information about a student's assignment and what they're actually writing about and so on. And when there is a signal and there's a noise, this thing called signal theory or signal detection theory tells us that the signal is present and we get it. That was called a hit. When we miss it, we don't get it, it's called a miss. And when the signal's not present and we miss it, not present, but we think it's there, that's a false alarm. When it's not present and we think it's not present, that's a correct rejection. Now, what we want to do is maximize hits and correct rejections and minimize misses and false alarms. We have things like Turnitin text matching software, Erkin text matching software that help us with this, help us pick up what might be a match to a breach of academic integrity or plagiarism, but they don't do this perfectly. So sometimes we get false alarms and sometimes we get misses. And lots of the work around signal detection theory might help inform us how we do all that detection process better. Okay. Just to wrap up, any good academic integrity talk should have some references on it. Here's a lot of the ones of mine that I've been talking about in here, and then I'll throw to questions. Right. So sorry about the internet disruption, but hopefully I'll remain with you for the rest of the time.
Thank you so much, Guy. That was a joy, and gee, you picked up right where you left off once you got reconnected. So very, very smooth.
Excellent.
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions in there right now, and everyone, please do continue to add questions in and thumbs up the questions that you like. The most thumbs upped question is from an anonymous attendee who says, how can we help students to realize that the short-term benefits of cheating will create long-term negative consequences for learning and employment?
It's funny, actually. I was listening to a podcast last night, and someone was talking about, someone who was a former alcoholic was talking about their experience of despair, and they come across other alcoholics that ask them for help. And one of the problems that those people have is despair. And he said that for him, he thinks despair is a failure of perspective, because that's how you feel now and that's how you think things are going to be now. But actually the perspective is that in the long term, there's actually things potentially to be optimistic about. I think when people are thinking short term, you have to retrain thinking. You have to get people to deliberately take another perspective to think long term. We know this works, for example, in the area of psychology. I work in organizational psychology and conflict management. When people are thinking about a conflict and they're all engaged, they think it's really important, and if we don't solve this now, everything will be terrible forever. And then you ask them the question, 100 years time, is this going to matter? And people go, well, probably not, and you see a lot of angst that people have over lots of things in the world of, is this really going to matter in 5, 10, 20 years time? There's a lot of psychology research on regret as well, that people tend to regret stuff in the long term that they haven't done, like doing the right thing, and in the short term they might regret taking a risk and doing something. So there's potentially lots of different sources we could draw on to think about how we could reframe people's perspective there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So the next question is from Lorraine Hurley, who says, did you find with BTS, so Bayesian Truth Theorem, much overlap between custom ghostwriting and file sharing, or are they separate cohorts?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I actually got my hands on Tracy Brettag's big 14,000 person survey, and those looked in her data like separate, not too much overlap. In mine, there was a little bit of overlap. So if you look at the self-admission of the two things together, I think it adds up to be less than if you add the two numbers separately, which means there is some overlap. I think the overlap was a decimal point of a percentage in the survey, but that means of the people who do it, it's actually probably like a quarter.
That's really,
maths makes sense to me.
It's surprising to me. So that's really interesting. I'd sort of assumed if you're doing one, you're probably going to be doing the other.
Yeah, look, I mean, when we were looking at the question of why students don't engage in contract cheating, one of the barriers we asked people about to engage in contract cheating was the cost. Like, we generally ask a question like, I would not do it because it is too expensive. If you go onto a file sharing site where you can obtain a previously written assignment, you can swap some of your old assignments or your lecture notes, and you can obtain something for free, and then you could put your name on it and submit that, or you could modify it a bit and submit that. If you're getting someone to custom ghostwrite something for you, you need to pay them. And so I'm fully aware a lot of students are right on the edge of every cent that they have got and can't do things that are going to cost them money. Maybe that's saving us from more cheating in some instances, but that's what I would think is going on.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So our next question's from Cradle's Roller Ajawi. And Roller says, is there any research that links academic failure, failing an assessment, and cheating in any direction? For example, is there a correlation between having failed, then cheating, or failing after cheating? And how would theory of planned behavior explain this beyond negative emotions?
Yeah, so it's interesting, the failing thing. I know there's research connecting marks and academic misconduct. So people who have higher marks might be more likely to cheat in American colleges because they need the high marks to maintain a scholarship, whereas people who have high marks might be less likely to cheat in Australian universities because they're getting high marks because they study and they have a learning based approach rather than a goal-based approach to how they're studying, and so they do better for that reason. And so misconduct doesn't really look like a thing that they want to do. But yeah, where marks tip over to the fail point, that's an interesting one. I'm not sure what is out there, but it'd be great to come up with some ideas about what we could investigate. And it actually sounds like the question has got some already, which sound really worth asking and investigating.
Yeah, well, I know Roller's been doing a fair bit of work on academic failure. So yeah, could be an interesting thing to connect. Okay, so we've got a thank you for the reference list, which is always good. We've got Mary McGovern says, in your opinion, what is the role of assessment design in reducing academic integrity issues? What should we be doing as educators?
Yeah, assessment design is really important because there's some assessments that are easily cheatable. If you're reusing an assessment that's been used over and over again, there'll always be copies of students' responses to that. There might be copies of the questions that they can prepare for, or things like that. Particularly with file sharing sites now, at least these things get around. But even before file sharing sites, I'll share you. I promised no stories to some extent, but I'll share a story. I know someone who studied medicine. They had a system in studying medicine in the 1980s, so before the internet. What they did was about 20 students would all nominate to remember 5 questions each out of the exam. After the exam, they would all write down the questions that they had memorized from the exam, and then that database of questions that had appeared in the exam would be shared with students who took the unit the next time around. The academics were not aware of this, so potentially students were going in having seen all the questions that were likely to appear in the exam. Obviously, there's a well-organized method of trying to cheat to study for this, but that's what they did. Now, reuse of questions, obviously, don't. Unsupervised online tests, don't. But there are some things that, even though they are still cheatable, and everything is potentially cheatable, might be less cheatable. So something that students are engaged in where they might have a bit of a choice of topic, that might be good because they can do what they like. They can follow their interests. People like to be able to do that. Authentic assessment is harder to cheat, but I mean, it's still cheatable, but harder to cheat. Reflections on engagement in whatever people have done is harder to cheat. And I'm sure I was going to say one other, vivas, so asking people to explain something verbally. But all of these are things that are a bit more resource intensive as well. But certainly for anything where you're doing a written assignment where there's an exam, an essay, literature review, a report, if you have a reflective component in there, that can be a small add-on to that particular kind of assessment. And that's always good for making sure that the person who was in the room that the thing was done or went about researching their essay by reading stuff can tell you, how they actually got there. But yeah, nothing's perfect, but some things are better.
I think that's a neat summary. Yeah, nothing's
Yeah.
perfect. Some things are better. I have to say, with that particular question, a struggle that I have is around the different types of evidence we might use to evidence a response to that sort of question, because that's really the question that people want to know the answer to. But my read on the literature is there's not a lot of high quality evidence around that. And I'm not even sure what high quality evidence would look like. Sorry, I'm looking at the time. I'll give you a moment to
Yeah.
reflect on that, because I've just noticed it's 2:58, which means we're almost at 3, which is, the gracefully exit the virtual seminar room door if you want to, or stick around for a little while longer. We won't go past 3:30 and continue to have a chat with Guy. And we've got a lot more questions to work through. And I got a few other things I want to ask. I just have to flag one more thing, which is that our next Cradle seminar will be on the 9th of August. So same day of the week and time as this one. And it will be Professor Lambert Schuworth from Flinders University, who'll be talking about programmatic assessment, hype or necessary development. Lambert's really amazing to listen to, one of the sharpest thinkers in assessment. I always get so much from listening to him talk. So really encourage everyone to come along to that one as well. And also I want to, obviously we're going to keep talking, but I really want to thank you, Guy, for such an illuminating conversation and for being so generous with, your findings of what you're currently working on and where your brain's at right now.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So we've let everyone go who wants to, and yeah, I'd love your thoughts on the sort of how might we have an evidence base around what types of assessment are more robust.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think a lot of the research we would like to do on assessment security and academic integrity would involve looking at what markers can detect. And interestingly, I have been talking to someone recently thinking of a study of whether markers can detect contract cheating within a set of authentic assessments versus a set of typical standard, say, essay type things. So I know you, Phil, and Wendy Sutherland-Smith have done these studies on detecting contract cheating within assessments, but varying the kinds of assessments would be good. So there's that detection side. There's the what can markers do, but also we can ask students where they're cheating because they readily tell us in the context of I'm thinking online tests with the study that I did with my honours student last year, looking at psychopathy, anticipated guilt and shame, and all this through to behaviour. One of the questions we asked was, have you collaborated with other students in an online test? Have you Googled stuff in an online test? And it was 75-80% of students who'd Googled something while doing an unsupervised online test, and nearly 70% of students who'd collaborated with another student while doing an unsupervised online test. So what we ask students, we can find out as well. Sorry, I just had a little internet unstable message there. I was a bit worried.
Nah, we still got you. So okay. This is good.
Oh, am I still there?
Yep. Oh dear. I think we might be losing Guy. I'm not sure. All right. We will give Guy a minute or two to jump back on if he can. Otherwise, we may just have to end this one. So I'm just going to be in touch with Guy just to check in and see how things are going. So I'm just going to jump off for a sec, but I'll be back on.
Okay, I'm back. Hope that works.
Yep. All good. Yay. All good. We can hear you well. We can see you. Everything's great.
Cool. Okay. So hopefully this will sustain now for another 20 minutes and we can go through any other questions that were there.
That's all we're after. Okay. So we have a question from Catherine who says, can you tell us the 4 E's barriers of the Swiss cheese model, if we have time?
Sure. I can go through. I wonder if that was probably a bit that I was talking about that wasn't coming through.
Yeah, I think it might have been.
Yeah. Okay. So this actually came from my misspent youth doing some transport planning. It's environment engineering, education and enforcement. They talk about that in designing roads and thinking about car drivers and their behaviour on roads. Essentially, I was thinking about applying this to the context of academic integrity from a whole of university perspective on trying to make sure that the barriers are in place for academic integrity to be maintained. The environment, I was thinking, is really the whole university environment, the culture of the university, how we do things within it, the national culture, the legal framework that exists, and the regulatory framework that exists for universities. So that's environment. Engineering is about what we do to have security and academic integrity processes, which is basically our policy, our text matching software, our assessment design. So that's engineering. Education is about education for staff and students, and then enforcement is enforcing the actual academic misconduct rules and policies when they come into place. So you can think about if these things are barriers, we can have our policies, we can have our staff detecting things, but if they don't enforce it, the person still gets away with having engaged in some kind of misconduct. So that's the 4 E's.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. It's fascinating to know that you've drawn it from that background as well. I wonder what the painted on bike lane is of the academic integrity world. Yeah. Sorry, I nerd out on YouTube videos about urban infrastructure and whatever. Okay, but that's not what we're here for. We have an anonymous attendee saying, given the influence of emotions, norms, and attitudes on academic misconduct, is there particular language you would recommend we use to talk to students to reframe their thinking around committing academic misconduct?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the norms thing's really useful. The what is the right thing to do thing, which comes out of injunctive norms. There's evidence about what is the right thing to do. American academic integrity people for some years have been really keen on this idea of honor codes. Honor codes aren't just that there is a code that you should follow, but it's also that there's systematic enforcement of that. It might include things like what they call honor panels of students who adjudicate other student cases and so on. But that idea of setting out to people what the standards are expected to be and why they exist is really helpful. That's kind of the injunctive norm part. The descriptive norm bit, you can communicate where there are low levels of cheating. You don't want to sort of miscommunicate that, hey, everyone's doing it, because they're not. And in fact, people can get the feeling sometimes that everyone's doing it and they're not. And then if you tell people that, then students are going to think they have to cheat when they're not cheating. So there's what you don't say as well. What you do say is important. With attitudes, the psychology perspective on what attitude is it's actually a combination of what we know about something, how we feel about something, and what we do about that thing. And the what we know about something can be quite helpful. So the attitude itself of, I must cheat, or I must plagiarize, sometimes comes from not knowing how not to. The education part is really important about informing people how they properly cite and reference sources, how they can study for an exam effectively, that they retain information rather than feeling they have to sneak in some notes. All of those things are helpful. And of course, the security measures that go into any kind of assessment, maybe exams are a good example of this, help with that perceived behavioural control as well, that if you don't think you can cheat in that exam, you're not going to intend to. You'll intend to study instead. So we can attack it at all levels.
Great, thank you. Um, I'm actually going to jump in with one of mine now because I think I get to do that. Um, I wrote down a few here, but I guess the thing that really stood out to me was we know these things about particular traits that are associated with higher rates of cheating, yet we target our academic integrity interventions at either a broad student cohort or at some mythologized sort of student who gets into a difficult spot and cheats. It seems to be those are our two targets for like academic integrity education. How would we design academic integrity education to address the cohorts that you're seeing as having higher prevalence?
Yeah, so something like that, their dark triad of personality, the psychopathy, Machiavellianism, traits of personality that they're common enough and at high enough levels among the population that we see them in university students. Sometimes people say that the difference between people in prison and CEOs is that they're both psychopaths, but the people who are CEOs have better impulse control. So there's characteristics that exist in the world that might predispose people to some actions, but it's not you must do something just because you have that personality. There's always things that can constrain you in a situation. So if you think about a lecture theatre, we might have a lecture theatre full of 200 students all sitting there paying attention and writing notes, or at least paying attention if they're not writing notes. Or at least sitting there quietly if they're not doing anything else. But yet that room of 200 people will have a variety of introverts and extroverts, right? But the situation says the behavior that you engage in is just sitting there quietly. Maybe then if the lecturer calls for questions, it might be the extroverts who are more likely to say something. Right? So personality is going to predispose people to actions, but it's not necessarily going to be that they will do that thing all of the time. The situation is really important. So then the question becomes, if we have these personality traits that predispose people to behavior, how do we shape the situation to get that behavior to occur? So if we think, for example, about dark triad personality traits being more related to cheating, when we did the research on why students don't cheat, those personality traits predicted different reasons for not cheating than the lower levels of those traits. So people who are higher in Machiavellianism, psychopathy, narcissism, for example, were more likely to be dissuaded from cheating because the opportunity wasn't there. So the assessment security measures, or because they thought if they did it, they would get caught, and the consequences of being caught would be quite severe. So they're more dissuaded by that they could get caught and punished, or they're stopped by stopping them, whereas other students are more dissuaded from cheating by appealing to their goal of studying and learning while they're at university, or their morals and ethics. So yeah, essentially, when we then think about the whole of a university, you've got students with a range of personality traits. So you actually need to communicate to all of them. So we don't say, let's just target our message at people who are more likely to cheat. Let's target our messages to people who are likely to have different reasons for not cheating, so that we can persuade everyone. Because even the people who are less likely per se to cheat, they still might if the situation presented themselves. They didn't think it was a moral problem, if they were, as you said, under stress or pressure or something like that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. A lot of anonymous questions, Guy. I have no commentary to make on that, but it's a good thing that we have that functionality in the Zoom. Has there been studies investigating academic misconduct between individuals with a fixed mindset versus growth mindset? Do you think teaching students or individuals to acquire a growth mindset may potentially mitigate behaviour to committing academic misconduct?
Look, I think there was, but I can't remember offhand. I know I'm really, really sure I've seen someone talking about that recently. So the direct growth mindset stuff, for people who don't know, that is about thinking that you can learn and you can get better at things, rather than thinking that your abilities are fixed. I think, as I said, I think something exists, but that would be something I'd Google as much as anyone else. And my expectation is it probably would help with academic misconduct reduction, but I don't know for sure.
Thank you. And it is a thing about this literature on academic integrity. It is so vast. There is so much of it to keep up with. I really struggle, I have to say, because there's always new stuff coming out.
Yep.
Yeah. Felicity Prentice says, existing qual and quant data would suggest that the rate of formal reporting of suspected cases of contract cheating hovers around the 50% mark. As with decisions to cheat by students, the factors influencing the staff members' decision are complex. Do you think there might be a place for more theoretically driven approach to investigating this?
Yeah, potentially. And I think in general, we know a little bit about what staff do. A lot of staff don't report various instances of cheating because they find the processes and barriers that they have to go through really quite time consuming. And sometimes they don't think that the end result is that they will get anything out of doing it. So certainly universities have to educate their staff on their processes and why it's worth following up on cases. And really the big message on why it's worth following up on cases is that most students who are referred for an academic misconduct investigation once will never do it again. And so it's worth going through the procedures, even if that first engagement with staff over the issue is an educational one, explaining to students why they shouldn't have done what it is that was a concern, and how to do it better. And I did the academic misconduct investigation in my school, and most of my conversations are with first year students who have referenced incorrectly, and it's a chance to have a one-on-one conversation with someone about how to reference correctly, which is good for them, and I'll never see them again, and that's fine. But why staff wouldn't report that, that's those students then don't get the benefit of that essentially individualized attention. So we do always need to look at what's going on there. But I don't know if I remember all parts of Felicity's question. Might be to
just sort of
more
around
theoretically driven
theory,
approach, to that investigation. I think that's it's a good question. I'm trying to think what theoretical framework would be good at that. Actually, theory of planned behavior springs to mind, of course, but there may well be others. Yeah, there would be a combination of attitudes, perceived norms, and perceived behavioural control there. Particularly perceived norms if staff don't think other staff are reporting, for example. Why would you report if no one else does? Are you just the one lecturer who's reporting all of their students for cheating while the rest of them just turn a blind eye? That would affect your decision making.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, it sounds like a definitely space for more theoretically driven work there. I had another question. So there was talk around emotions being connected to things, and particularly negative emotions. In the feedback literature, there's been some stuff on sort of positive and negative emotions, but also activating and deactivating emotions. And it's just sort of that negative emotions around feedback aren't necessarily a bad thing if they're activating emotions that can lead to some action in response to the feedback information.
Yep.
I'm sort of wondering here, is this all negative affect, or is this like just particular
Yeah,
things?
so we, in particular, those couple of studies I was talking about, we were looking at a really general measure of positive and negative affect, which captures a lot of different things, people rating words on the extent to which they're feeling something now, or they generally feel something like sad, happy, anxious, nervous, and all that then gets sort of aggregated into just general positive and negative affect. Certainly it'd be worth having a look at the range of different emotions and how they can, what they can do to people's thinking around engagement in academic misconduct, because we know in the psychology literature, different affective, there's a whole range of different negative affective states. There's anxiety and sadness, but there's also fear and there's disgust, and all these things actually motivate us to do different things, and they exist for different evolutionary reasons. And it might be more dissuaded by or to engage in academic misconduct if we found it disgusting, for example. But and then, as I said, there's moral emotions like guilt and shame and these sorts of things. So there's a lot to unpack there potentially, and I think there's scope for quite a lot more work in that area. Beyond that, there are trait emotions, so how we tend to feel, how we usually feel. Some people just in general are more likely to feel some emotions than others, or experience some emotional states more often than others, or more intensely than others. And then there's state emotions, so how we feel at the moment. And all of which can be things that impact on our thinking and our behavior. So yeah, really big area there potentially.
Wow, huge. Really great that you've done the first study on it, and it sounds like there's room for many, many more. Okay, got a question here from Rachel K3. Students may be acopic. Now, I had to look up what acopic meant, and where's my
I think
tab?
I would too.
Yeah. So, acopic seems to have a variety of definitions within medicine: unable to function or cope. But then it also seems to have kind of an opposite meaning as well, of relieving weariness or being restorative. So the question is, students may be acopic.
Rachel, not cope being mentioned on the chat. So not being able to cope.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, go. Sorry.
So students may be that. This may facilitate a breach in academic integrity. This has implications for their mental health, and also reporting to peak bodies such as APRA.
Yeah, actually, coping would be a really interesting thing to look at, because again, in psychology, there's a vast literature on coping, and it's not just a single thing, because there's measures of the different ways in which people attempt to cope with things, and one of the things I've been looking at actually in my research on leadership is people's coping approaches and their leadership performance and leadership behaviours. Something I find in there is that people who have a tendency to take action in response to a problem, which is a form of coping with it by engaging in a behaviour, or what's called problem-focused coping in a lot of the literature, tend to do better in a lot of the leadership measures that I've looked at in that research than people who have what's called an emotion-focused coping, where you just, you're trying to deal with the emotions in your head and sort of calm yourself down or whatever, rather than doing something about the actual problem. So yeah, I mean, even that very simple emotion-focused versus problem-focused coping distinction might be really interesting to look at. If are students engaging in more academic misconduct if they have one coping style versus another. Also, there's plenty of negative coping styles, things that people can do that they do to try to cope with the stresses of life that are just self-destructive, like, for example, consuming drugs and alcohol, which is a coping mechanism. It's just not a good one. And then, huge, vast, again, literature there in psychology that could be brought into this space, and we see what students are doing and how it's interacting with their studies and approach to study, and potentially approach to not doing their assessment the right way.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Really helpful to have that thought about coping brought in there. I got a kind of a weird question from me, which is sort of your experience of working in a field that's as someone from a psychology background, working in a field that's not largely occupied by people like that. I can say in CRADLE's work on feedback, that some of the feedback work comes from education people and some of it comes from psychology people. And some of the challenge that we have is finding the middle ground, or the ways in which our work might be compatible with each other. Do you face those sort of challenges working in academic integrity?
Yeah, to some extent. So I've sort of develop an appreciation of the different perspectives that people come from in working on academic integrity problems, because there's so much breadth to the literature. There's the educational perspective, there's the legal perspective, there's qualitative and quantitative research methods that people take. There's not a lot that's very experimental. There's a lot in design, but I think that potentially needs to be used more. But it's I think to some extent you've got to be a bit accepting of people's point of view and just go, oh, there's a bit I don't know here, or a bit more that I need to learn about to understand this, and which is great. I mean, that's one of the great things about working in academic spaces. You're always learning, and if you follow your interest, you have to learn new stuff. Much as I learned new ideas from education researchers and things like that have informed me in what I do. Hopefully I'm inserting some ideas that will be helpful to other people. But at the same time, I'm doing things like, for example, the analysis of some of these studies using statistics I was never taught in my undergraduate studies. I've had to learn how to do to analyze data that I've got in the way that'll answer the question that I've got. So always learning, and that's one of the great things about our job.
Yeah. I know Roller says in the chat, so Roller's been in some of these feedback conversations. We don't agree on even definitions or where the phenomenon is located around feedback. Yeah. Do we face that in the sort of cheating integrity sort of literature as well?
Yeah, that's one of the things that hopefully. I think the psychology point of view of how you write up studies is quite good. That we always have that idea of you've got to define your terms. So you get into the what's your big picture question? What are your terms? What do you really mean by them? So that we know what we're talking about. And then it's like, okay, let's just say contract cheating. All right, we might have a study where someone said, hey, this is a study of contract cheating, but if you define the term and you go look at what they've actually done or what they've measured or whatever else, it's like, no, it really wasn't. Or yeah, it is, but it's only this part of it. And that's really that defining terms thing is always helpful to progress where you're going. So you can say, I definitely have talked about this, but I know I haven't talked about that, because I know what my terms were and how I define them and how I've operationalized them in, say, measures or something.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, the definition of feedback is a very live question that can just lead to hours of debate. We have one last question in the Q&A that we'll attend to, and then we'll wind up. And the question is, with contract cheating sites, does the fear of being blackmailed act as a it says an issue as to whether to do so. I guess, is blackmail in students' minds?
Okay. So the study by John York, Leslie Stefik, and I think someone else, that might have been Tricia. Anyway, three people from Curtin University, led by John York. They looked at intentions to engage in contract cheating. They prompted some people with the possibility of being blackmailed by the contract cheating sites, and some not. Those who were prompted with the possibility that they might get blackmailed were then much less likely to report an intention to engage in contract cheating. So what that suggests is, because they did prompt some people, other people weren't thinking about it without being prompted, or weren't thinking about it as much. So clearly the prompting is helpful, because it I guess naturalistically, their control group were people who may not have been thinking about it as much as their experimental group. So yeah, that's a yes. Remind students that it can happen, because they may not be thinking about it by themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good spot to finish on, the sort of messaging that we give to students, that really honest messaging about what the dangers of some of this stuff is. Yeah, so thanks so much, Guy. I got so much out of that. I think people are going to love the recording, and really look forward to some of those other papers being shared. If people want to follow you and your work, in the bio that we gave people, there's a link to your page on UWA. Is there anything else you'd like people to sort of follow up of yours?
Nope. You can look me up at UWA, or my research papers come onto there, and that's it. I'm on Twitter, and so you can find me. I'm
Great.
around.
Thanks so much, Guy. Really appreciate it. And we'll see everyone who's interested in our next seminar on the 9th of August with Professor Lambert Shuworth on programmatic assessment. Thanks so much, Guy.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone who attended.